When we think of cortisol, which was the first sort of marker that you saw was elevated, we think of stress. So we think we get cortisol if we're stressed. So my brain, my very naive brain said, well, you just need to be less stressed, Sarah. So you should just go on a holiday and then your cortisol will come down.
I used to think that too, and then I would come back from the holiday and I would still have cortisol problems. So, stress is part of it, but cortisol is really interesting. These hormones that we're talking about, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, cortisol, insulin, it's not a democracy. Like, they don't have equal footing. Cortisol is more like a dictator, especially if it's out of whack. So, you need cortisol to live. Whereas you could live without testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. Can't live without insulin, but cortisol is critical in terms of helping you with your immune system, helping you with your blood sugar, and just managing the stress response. So it's not quite as simple as thinking your way out of a high cortisol or a low cortisol. And there are ways that your body can become stuck in a particular pattern of making too much cortisol or making not enough cortisol.
And if my body's making too much cortisol and my levels are too high, what is the harm?
The harm is it's associated with depression. It's about 50% of people with high cortisol, 50% of people with depression have high cortisol. It's used by some psychiatrists as a suicide marker. It's associated with more belly fat. And so the fat receptors, the fat cells in your belly have increased receptors for cortisol. So it's a way of growing your belly fat. We know that it shrinks the brain in women, but not men. Starting in midlife, starting in your 40s. It's not an old age thing. And this has been shown a couple of different ways. There was a study from the University of Texas in San Antonio showing that women in their 40s with high cortisol have a shrinkage of total brain volume. And then Lisa Mosconi at Cornell also just showed in a study looking at men and women that women with high cortisol also have shrinkage of their total brain volume. And they start to have a difficult time using glucose as fuel in their brain.
Which is going to result in what kind of behaviors?
Well, it makes you tired. It gives you slow brain energy. And I can tell for the most part you don't have that. But if you do have it, there's a way that you kind of your brain slows down, you feel foggy, you're not able to multitask and kind of keep up with everything.
Is there a link between cortisol and trauma?
Oh, yes.
What is that link?
So for people who experience toxic stress or trauma, what typically happens is cortisol goes up. That's part of the alarm,
Yeah.
the body's stress response. What we know is that for people who've got more serious exposure to trauma and they have post traumatic stress disorder, those people have probably gone through a period of high cortisol and now they can't keep up anymore. And they are in a low cortisol state.
What are the things in the world at the moment that are messing up our hormones? Because the subject matter of hormones has become increasingly popular. And I know that there's hormones like cortisol, which we've talked about, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, insulin, glucose. What are the big things that are like messing up our hormones at the moment? If because I want to make sure my hormones are in check. So I'm a guy, and I'm sure that there's some of these hormones are more like things like estrogen have, I think, are more pertinent to women. But
No, it's important for men
oh,
too.
really?
So estrogen and progesterone are incredibly important for men. And it's involved in bone strength. Progesterone's involved in sleep in men. So the levels are lower in men and your testosterone's about 10 times higher. But in women and men, they're all important. So what's messing with our hormones? I would say toxin exposure. So there's endocrine disruptors. There's more than 700 known endocrine disruptors, things like bisphenol A, um, like the plastic lining that you see in cans or in plastic containers, water containers. There's skincare products, which women are exposed to more, things like moisturizer and makeup and other things that contain um, endocrine disruptors like parabens and um, there's flame retardants that we get exposed to. So there's a whole class of endocrine disruptors. And then it feels right now like we are more dysregulated than I've ever seen. And I'm not sure what the cause is. I don't know if it's the post pandemic experience or part of what we're experiencing in the United States with the change in leadership. It just feels like there's this hum of dysregulation that I haven't seen over my career. Are you noticing that?
Are you seeing that in your patients? And
I see it in my patients. I see it in their wearable data. I see it in heart rate variability. I see it in the cortisol levels that I'm measuring.
you asked if I'm noticing that. I mean, the more digital the world has become, I think I've seen more dysregulation, and we're obviously moving further in that direction at rapid speed, especially with things like AI now and algorithms getting more smart and addictive.
Yes.
So I see that. Also, there's just been a change in. I think the algorithms, the social media algorithms, will compete with themselves to see who can hold you the most, and to do that, they have to kind of grab your attention. And the easiest ways to grab your attention is by showing you things that are probably dysregulating.
Yes. It's an attention economy. And the cost in that fight for attention is that often the nervous system becomes more dysregulated.
So if you had to come into my life and you had to optimize my life to make sure that all my hormones were in check, you would get rid of plastics and toxins from my everyday life, my bathroom, etc.
I'd look at your skincare, I'd look at your cleaning products, I'd look at your air quality. I'd probably install a couple of air filters if you don't have that. I'd wanna know about your stress because you're someone who performs at such a high level, and I would assume that you found the right level of stress, where it's not so little that you're not productive, but it's not to excess to the point that there's a cost to it physiologically.
Yeah. And then
And I'd wanna look at your food. I'd wanna know how much protein you're consuming. Are you getting the right amount of carbohydrates? Seems like you are. Are you utilizing those well? What's going on with the continuous glucose monitor? How are your nutrients? What's your vitamin D? Things like that.
you're a big fan of continuous glucose monitors, aren't you?
I am. I think it gives real time feedback, immediate feedback on the food that you're eating. I've seen nothing else change behavior like a continuous glucose monitor.
And for anybody that doesn't know, it's the little patch you put on your arm and it tells you your blood sugar levels in real time straight to your phone. Sugar, is sugar the enemy?
I don't think sugar's the enemy. I think the enemy is the way that we eat it to excess, the way that we use it to change our emotional state. And we know people who have adverse childhood experiences, they're more likely to have disordered eating. They're more likely to have problems modulating the amount of sugar they consume.
When you're treating patients, do you focus heavily on their blood sugar levels?
I do because I think it's an important indicator of the way the biochemistry of the body, the metabolism is working. It tells me about their mitochondria. It tells me about the way that they're producing energy, ATP by ATP, this compound, this measure of energy that you produce inside of all of your cells,
Which is called ATP.
ATP.
And that ATP then drives what? It drives our everything we do.
ATP is fuel. So it allows you to feel like you're fully energized, especially when you wake up in the morning.
And are there any supplements that I should be taking if I'm trying to optimize my hormonal balance?
Well, I'd have to look at your total picture, but most of us inherit somewhere around 5 to 7 genomic um, vulnerabilities, and often we want to work around those. So, for instance, for me, my vitamin D receptor sucks. It just doesn't work very well. So, I have to take increased levels of vitamin D to keep the kind of the baseline amount of vitamin D in my system normal. So, we would want to look for those. We'd look at your genomics to see what's your relationship to B vitamins? With the stress that you manage, do you have a deficit with B vitamins? For a lot of men, it doesn't show up until around age 40. So this is a good time for you to do a baseline.
When you look at people's biomarkers and their blood samples, what are the things that you like typically always see that are deficient? Because I'm sure there's things from a social level that we're just all kind of getting wrong.
Vitamin D is common. So somewhere around 70 to 80% of people don't have enough vitamin D. And one of the things that I think is so important to realize about vitamin D is that it's got 400 jobs in the body. One of them is keeping your boundary in your gut intact. So keeping tight junctions working so that you don't have leaky gut. So vitamin D is a common one. I had an executive that I took care of on Tuesday, and he had a fasting glucose of 102, which is in the prediabetes range. No doctor has pointed this out to him before. He had his cholesterol was starting to climb. His blood pressure was borderline, not high enough to require a medication, but at the point where we want to turn that ship around before he needs a medication. He had a level of inflammation in his body that was causing aches and pains and um, kind of like this silent condition that um, wasn't working well for him. So there's a couple ways to measure that. For him, his homocysteine was elevated. It was 14.7. And that's one that's really easy to measure in a basic panel. What we want with homocysteine, which is heart specific inflammation, we want that to be 5 to 7. And when it's elevated, that tells us that often part of the biochemistry in the body, your methylation, is not working well. Methylation is just where you add a carbon and 3 hydrogens to a molecule. And it's a way that we turn genes on and off. And so in this person's case, he wasn't getting enough B vitamins, methylated B vitamins. So we started him on a supplement to help him with that. So that's a common one. His testosterone was good, so didn't have to address that. This guy was about 52. His cortisol was good. He was the chief financial officer of a company back east. Well, he had a number of things on his genomics that we needed to pay attention to. What was interesting about this guy, Steve, is that he was an athlete. He played football in high school and college. He had this identity as an athlete. But when he came to see me at age 52, he was barely exercising. He would lift weights maybe once a week. He would go swimming for about 30 minutes once a week. And so he wasn't leveraging disposal of glucose the way that he could be, the way that he used to when he was in his 20s. So, a big part of understanding what made him tick was to reaffirm this identity as an athlete and to use that to address this metabolic crisis that was starting to happen in his body before it was too late.
Because he's got too much glucose and he's not doing enough with it.
That's right.
So his body is having to store it and getting inflamed.
And he said, listen, it's been the Christmas holidays. I had a lot of pound cake. I had some cocktails. Maybe that's part of the problem. But we had measured his hemoglobin A1C, which is the 3-month summary of what's happening with your glucoses. And the problem predated Christmas. So we needed to get him into action around exercise.
Getting back to hormones, I really want to close off on this subject of cortisol because I know that that's such a important hormone. I've heard you say before that you believe that cortisol is the most critical hormone to get into balance. You want to focus on cortisol really first and foremost. So, someone like me, is there anything else I need to know to get my cortisol levels in balance? And also, what percentage of the population do you think have their cortisol out of whack?
Mm. So we don't have data on the numerator or the denominator. And my patient population is enriched with people who've got cortisol problems. So out of all of the people I test, somewhere around 90% of them have a problem with their cortisol. And that includes professional athletes, because at least in the US, like basketball players, they travel a ton, they play back-to-back games, they've got a cortisol load, a stress load that is pretty high, even for someone in their 20s or 30s who's used to high performance. So, the number is high. If I had to look at the general population, it would be a total speculation. I would say somewhere around 30 to 50%.
And what do you do about that if you're an athlete and you've got elevated cortisol levels?
I think there's a number of different things. There's the top-down approach, which is cognitive, kind of like, what is my prefrontal cortex? How can I leverage that to work with this? And then there's more of a bottom-up approach, which is using your senses to create safety and to change the cortisol signal, kind of the alarm and the way that it goes off in the body. So breath work is really important for that, meditation, different forms of movement, dancing, rhythmic movements, walking, hiking. Running's a little tricky because that can be a stress response and it can raise cortisol. Um, so I would say for a professional athlete, what I usually recommend is meditation, regular meditation, and finding what's a really good fit for them. Because, for some people, mindfulness based stress reduction is a good fit, but that doesn't fit for everyone. Other people like resonance breathing, like a 5-second inhale, 7-second exhale, 6 breaths per minute, doing that for 10 to 20 minutes. That can really help to create balance between the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. For some of my athletes, it's a supplement. So if they've got high cortisol, one of the things I often do is to give them Cortisol Manager, which is a supplement that includes ashwagandha and phosphatidylserine, and it's been shown to lower cortisol levels. So if they're traveling and they have to take a plane back to Philadelphia after an away game, Cortisol Manager can help them manage the cortisol.
I've found a supplement called, I can't pronounce the name properly, but Rodiol?
Oh, rhodiola?
Rhodiola.
Yes, rhodiola is an adaptogen. So it's an herbal therapy that's been shown to help with cortisol.
Lowers cortisol.
Yes.
And I was reading that it increases your focus potentially.
Yes, it does.
Do you prescribe that to athletes?
I do. So generally what I try to do with most of my athletes is have them take a supplement either first thing in the morning or before they go to bed. It's harder to do it during the day. And so I tend to start with Cortisol Manager because I think it's got the best data. But rhodiola is also a good choice, and I have prescribed that.
Is it easy for people to change in this regard? To get them to make a set of different decisions? I think we're at a time of year where a lot of people are thinking about changes, and a lot of people are failing repetitively every year at the changes they say they want to make. Is it easy to get someone to change?
I would say behavior change is the hardest thing that we do as humans. I think there are ways that adverse childhood experiences tend to set a pattern that's very hard to break. But I see people change their behavior all the time. And I think part of it depends on what's the pain of staying the same. If it's high enough to motivate you and to help you, not take the shot or two of tequila that has been your downfall in the past. If you have something that keeps you accountable and has like the Hawthorne effect, like a continuous glucose monitor, I think that can also be very helpful. as if someone was watching you, because my patients with their continuous glucose data, I am watching them. I'm scanning them.
But doesn't that mean that in order to change, some people just need a bit more pain?
I would say people have a different level of pain that motivates change.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.